Welcome, dear listeners, to Shadow Evidence. An accounting book vanishes, and with it more than numbers. Down the dim lanes of Fen Street, silence covers debts, betrayals, and secrets no one dares to name. Who profits from a ledger lost, and whose past is being erased? Before we begin the mystery, take a moment to sharpen your wits. There's a quick riddle for you. Keep your answer ready. Are you listening in the stillness of night or during your morning tea? Tell us below. If mysteries cloaked in shadow intrigue you, like this video and subscribe to join the investigation. Now, light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. By 7:30 on a Thursday evening, the council chamber at Flaxborough Town Hall had warmed to the temperature of a resigned teapot. The borough's Improvement and Amenities Committee sat beneath portraits of aldermen who had spent their lives improving very little and found amenities chiefly in the awarding of contracts to cousins. The atmosphere smelt faintly of polish, mothballs, and the municipal idea of coffee. At one end of the long green baize table sat Mrs. Beatrice Plimpton, an alderwoman in the sense that she wore pearls as if they had been awarded for service. She had arranged her papers in a fan precisely calculated to be visible to members of the public, of whom there were two, a retired postmaster who came religiously to meetings in the hope of seeing someone told off, and a woman from the Allotment Society who had not yet forgiven the council for moving the public conveniences 5 yards nearer her marrows. Mrs. Plimpton cleared her throat with the gentle authority of a kettle approaching the boil. Item 1, she said, the reading of the minutes. The town clerk, Mr. Swithenbank, rose slightly from his chair, like a loaf that had not quite proved, and read out 10 minutes that might as well have been the same 10 minutes read out last month and the month before. They recorded sensible, frugal, proper intentions as to lamp standards and shrubbery. Nobody interrupted. Interruptions were for people who didn't have their name on the deeds of things. Item 2, said Mrs. Plimpton, the presentation of the borough treasurer's quarterly accounts. Here, something unusual occurred, though it occurred with such politeness that it took a while for anyone to notice. Mr. Wycherley, the treasurer, a narrow man whose jacket appeared to have been designed for an altogether narrower man, stood up with a stiff smile, put his hand out to receive the ledger that was not there, and then allowed his hand to fall again, with the air of someone accepting an abstract loss. The ledger, he said, is unfortunately not presently in the cabinet. There was a small domestic silence, the sort that falls when a host confesses to having burnt the pudding. Eyes moved, not dramatically, towards the glass-fronted bookcase beneath the case clock. It held the dull, solid backs of volumes that had been bound in the belief that permanence could be stitched into cloth. The shelf where the borough accounts ought to have been displayed, heavy and self-satisfied, showed instead a thin blue annual of the Northern Amateur Rowing Association, 1931. Sergeant Love, who had been sent to sit discreetly behind the public rail in case of any administrative riot, leaned forward, blinking. He was a large young man who wore his uniform as if it were a set of new school clothes, proud of it and slightly itchy. His thoughts, far from municipal finance, were tracking a meat pie left cooling on a kitchen windowsill in Hannah Love's capable keeping. He often thought of pie in times of stress. Now he thought of it with the particular urgency that attaches to a pie which is clearly not safe in a town of cats. "Bert," said Mrs. Plimpton, turning to the far corner of the room where the caretaker stood like a faithful floorcloth, "would you kindly unlock the case? There appears to have been a misunderstanding." Mr. Doughty, who had mopped more civic sorrow than most vicars, advanced with his keys. "It was locked this afternoon, madam," he said, with the humble pride of a man who keeps things shut, "as I always do after I dust." He selected a key with puritanical care, inserted it, turned, and opened the case. The little click had the sound of a mild scandal beginning. Mr. Wycherley stooped. He lifted the blue rowing annual with 2 fingers as though it might very well scull off by itself. "This is not the ledger," he said redundantly. His mind, running down its careful grooves, tried to account for the loss of something that was defined by never being lost. He had been treasurer for 14 years, and had known the ledger longer than his wife. The ledger had been, the borough's conscience, a stout ruled reserve of entries in brown ink that made a hymn of rates and rents. The idea that it might be anywhere but where it had always been seemed not so much a misplacement as a moral lapse. "We must have the figures," said Mrs. Plimpton, with the unassailable conviction of someone to whom figures arrange themselves obediently on other people's burdens. "What can be done, Mr. Swithenbank?" The town clerk rubbed the bridge of his nose in an administrative way as though warranting several papers into being. "One cannot present the accounts without the ledger, madam. We could, of course, postpone." "Postpone?" said the allotted woman in the gallery, forgetting herself. "That's what you said about the lav." She coloured and sat back, suppressing the word in time. Respectability in Flaxborough did not forbid frankness. It merely asked that one be frank quietly. Mrs. Plimpton glanced towards the gallery and allowed her disapproval to fall like a lace curtain. Then she turned her gaze to the far end of the table, where a man of medium build sat with the gravity that small men in provincial pictures sometimes wear to suggest they are more important than they look. He was not more important than he looked, because he looked like Inspector Purbright, who in Flaxborough was important enough. Purbright inclined his head. There was in his manner the gentle patience of a librarian faced with the sudden disappearance of a much-consulted dictionary. "I wonder," he said, "whether anyone has removed the volume for the purposes of reference." This seemed reasonable enough to people who believed in purposes. Those who did not, as a matter of principle, said nothing. "I saw it there at 4 o'clock, volunteered Mr. Doughty gratefully. "I always give the glass a wipe before I go off to put the flags away." "Was the case locked then?" Purbright asked mildly. "Oh, aye." Mr. Doughty frowned, as if doubting whether a thing properly locked could nevertheless be empty. "Key never leaves me, except when I take it off to boil me eggs, and that was only the once, Inspector." There was a faint stir of amusement. Flaxborough approved of harmless confessions. They suggested a useful habit of telling the police small things. "Thank you." Purbright's eyes wandered to the window where the reflection of the chamber's lights made a hazy aquarium of the night. Beyond lay the market square, with its cast-iron lamp standard and its pigeons asleep in civic attitudes. A light rain began to dot the glass like punctuation. Behind his mild regard, he was considering the ledger not as an object but as a gesture. Books did not vanish. People moved them. People in committees did not move things without agendas, formal or private. The private agendas were interesting. He wondered whose pockets presently contained more paper than usual. "Inspector," said Mrs. Plimpton, leaning forward as if conferring the town's IQ upon him, "would you be so good as to make suitable inquiries? We shall adjourn for 15 minutes while Mr. Swithenbank arranges for tea." She said tea with the finality of a rural magistrate pronouncing a sentence. The members stood, relieved to have something they were experienced in. Tea arrived, wheeled on by a second caretaker of indeterminate connection to Mr. Doughty. It is doubtful that town hall caretakers breed, but they certainly recruit in their own image. Cups had saucers that made small, civilized noises. Someone found biscuits of an age that recommended caution, and a jug of milk in a state of nature. Conversation started up with the bright, guilty cheerfulness peculiar to committees whose responsibility has temporarily been displaced onto the police. The retired postmaster leaned to the allotted woman and whispered, "They'll have mislaid it deliberately, you see. Can't be expected to answer to figures if the figures aren't there." He felt the warm glow of a satisfied theory. She, who disapproved of warmth except in greenhouses, nodded. Sergeant Love, watching a plate of ginger nuts inch in the direction of the alderwoman, wondered whether one could intercept a biscuit on police business. Perhaps not. He contented himself with the thought that pies, unlike ledgers, kept their place. He also, with the honesty of a young man, thought that if he were a thief of books, he would have chosen something with a storyline. Purbright, cup in hand, drifted to the bookcase. He lifted the rowing annual and leafed through it. The inside cover bore a neat name, written in an old-fashioned schoolboy hand, J. Cranch, Jr. He looked up. Councillor Cranch, who had been sitting with his mouth arranged in the unlit cigar shape of scepticism, caught the inspector's eye and smiled the cautious smile of a man who recognises something of his youth and does not propose to discuss it. Purbright replaced the annual in the gap that wasn't big enough. The shelf had been moved down a notch recently. The dust line told him so, though it told him nothing more than that dust, unlike committees, kept to its duties. He turned, amiable. "Mr. Wycherley," he said softly, "do you keep any duplicate of the quarter's figures?" The treasurer seemed to fight an internal battle between pride and practicality. "Totals, Inspector, on separate sheets, but the detailed entries, receipts and payments, small rents, petty cash, are only in the ledger." "And without the details," mused Purbright, "totals have a habit of losing their balance." "It is intolerable," declared Mrs. Plimpton. "The public expects punctuality." "The public," murmured Mr. Swithenbank to his teaspoon, expects entertainment. At that moment, the case clock, which had for years behaved like a relative who does not intrude but insists on being noticed, struck 8, once, then twice, then persisted until it had done its duty thoroughly and slightly beyond what was necessary. The sound seemed to settle into the fabric of the room like a vow. Purbright set down his cup. "If I might see, Mr. Doughty, where do you keep your keys when you're boiling eggs?" he asked, as if this were the natural sequel to tea. It was the tone in which he usually introduced investigations, and it rarely frightened anybody. "In the little cupboard on the landing, sir," said Doughty, pleased to be interested. "Only it sticks sometimes on damp nights." "Ah," said Purbright, as if that answered something delicate. "Perhaps you would show me while we're adjourned." They went out together, their footsteps softened by the town hall carpet's long memory. Love followed at a respectful distance, promising himself that if the cupboard yielded nothing, he would at least return by way of the refreshment table. Mrs. Plimpton, left behind, drew her pearls into order. She was already composing the paragraph she would offer the Mercury about the council's firm action and her own sorrow. Mr. Wycherley stared at the empty space on the shelf as though staring might produce figures by evaporation. In the gallery, the postmaster renewed his theory. The allotment woman, looking at the glass case, thought bitterly of glass houses and stones. On the landing, the little cupboard did indeed stick, and Doughty wrestled it open with the care of a man intruding upon someone's privacy, even if the someone was wood. Inside, a pegboard hung with keys on numbered tags. One hook quite low down was empty. Above it, a label read, "Display case, council chamber." Doughty frowned. Well, that's odd. I never leave it off a peg." "But you take it to boil eggs," Love ventured helpfully. "Aye, but I put it back, didn't I? Otherwise the eggs get notions." Purbright's gaze drifted to the rim of the cupboard, where a shallow dent showed as a moon in dust. Something had rested there recently, and not with reverence. He did not smile, but a faint pleasure entered his eyes, the recognition that people had been people again. "Thank you," he said. "We shall not keep the committee from their responsibilities." And he turned back towards the warm chamber, where figures had become an absence, and the absence had become a presence that would mean work. Outside the town hall, rain made a careful pattern on the square. The clock in St. Michael's prepared itself to agree with the case clock, a process it disliked. A bus went by with the curious air of a bus moving in a town that thinks it is a place and knows it is a habit. In one upstairs window of the Flaxborough Mercury offices, a young woman drew a headline pencil line as straight as a promise. "Council ledger missing. Accounts in limbo." She smiled because limbo looked good in bold, and she liked the idea of accounts going anywhere unusual at all. Back in the room, advisers resumed their chairs with the reluctant grace of churchgoers before a second hymn. Purbright stood, apologetic and calm. "If we may," he said, "proceed without the ledger for tonight, I shall attend its holiday." He let the word ease the tension. It was generally agreed that if an object was on holiday, it would come back wearing a slightly smug expression, which was at least comforting. Mrs. Plimpton nodded, not gratified but willing to be seen to be so. "Then we adjourned," she announced, "pending police inquiries." So it was that a quiet Thursday in Flaxborough registered a tremor very small on the great world's instruments, but large enough to set in motion the town's favourite machinery: speculation, reproach, and the adjustment of reputations. And the case of the missing ledger, so dull a phrase that it almost smothered the thing it described, had begun. The following morning, Flaxborough went about its business in the usual manner, which is to say with the briskness of a town that liked to be thought of as industrious, but never at the expense of comfort. The market square, still wet from the night's rain, smelled of fish, vegetables, and the faint melancholy of flowers that had given their best yesterday. Men who could balance a wooden trestle with one hand and scratch themselves with the other were erecting stalls. The Flaxborough Mercury delivery boy, who cycled with an air of both civic duty and mild delinquency, had already scattered headlines into parlour rooms where breakfast marmalade was beginning its day's campaign. "Council ledger missing," read the Mercury, in letters that attempted alarm but fell short of it, as though unwilling to disturb porridge. Below it, in smaller print, "Serious questions of accountability." The postmaster's theory, relayed to the reporter with a solemnity that made him sound almost reputable, had been condensed into a phrase about possible irregularities. It was the kind of irregularity that Flaxborough readers enjoyed in principle, since it gave them leave to suppose others are less proper than themselves. At the police station, Inspector Purbright was reading the paper with the faint smile of a man who preferred gossip at first hand. Sergeant Love, whose pie had indeed survived the night but had been shared without mercy among his brothers, leaned across the desk. "Do you think it's a scandal, sir?" he asked. "I mean, like what the paper says, irregularities." Purbright folded the paper and set it aside with care, as if its value lay in its neatness rather than its news. "Scandal," he said mildly, "is rather like influenza, Sergeant. There are always cases about, but one must be sure before declaring an epidemic." Love nodded solemnly, not entirely clear whether this was a medical opinion or a warning. He busied himself straightening a stack of blotters, which did not need straightening, while Purbright reached for a file of council correspondence that might or might not yield something enlightening. The morning promised to be one of quiet inquiry rather than grand investigation. Purbright began with the town clerk, Mr. Swithenbank, who had agreed to meet him at the town hall office, surrounded by pigeonhole shelves that suggested a mind incapable of tolerating open space. The clerk greeted Purbright with the air of a man welcoming a not unwelcome intrusion, provided it might be tidied away afterwards. "I fear, Inspector, that the loss has already taken on a life of its own," Swithenbank said, indicating the Mercury headline with a finger that held the nicotine shade of civic service. "I have had 3 telephone calls this morning inquiring whether the council remains solvent. One was from a ratepayer, the others from ladies who wish to be sure the floral competition prizes are still available." Purbright allowed himself a mild cough that could be interpreted as sympathy. "I take it no one had a legitimate reason to remove the ledger." Swithenbank pressed his lips together, as though about to refuse an extra pudding. "It is consulted occasionally, by auditors, committee members, councillors who like to parade their diligence, but always here, in this building, never taken away. Mr. Wycherley guards it as if it were his baptismal certificate." "And yet," Purbright said, "a rowing annual has found its way into the case instead." The clerk frowned, not liking the joke even if it was accurate. "I remarked on that myself. A substitution of all things. It suggests deliberation. One does not accidentally remove a ledger of several pounds weight and replace it with a booklet." "That was my thought," Purbright agreed quietly. "Do you know of anyone who might have had both the opportunity and the inclination?" Swithenbank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, which made a protesting squeak. "In Flaxborough, Inspector, there is always an inclination. As for opportunity, well, the chamber is not entirely secure. Staff, caretakers, councillors, members of subcommittees, all have access on various pretexts. In my opinion, if you will forgive my frankness, the matter is likely to be rooted in politics." Purbright did not look surprised. Matters were usually rooted in politics, if only by their toes. He let the suggestion rest, filing away the useful observation that Swithenbank seemed more keen to assign blame than to establish facts. When Purbright emerged once more into the grey morning, he found Love waiting beside the station car, his expression bright with news. "Mrs. Plimpton's been in touch, sir. She's called an extraordinary meeting of the Amenities Committee for tomorrow evening. I want you to attend and give a report. Said the public must see the police acting. What was the word she used? Decisively." Purbright's eyebrows rose a fraction. Decisive is a word people employ when they mean swift rather than sure. Still, we must oblige. They set off slowly down the high street, Purbright not in any hurry, as though investigation were best approached at a walking pace. As they passed the newsagent, Mrs. Digby, proprietor and widow with a memory that encompassed half the misdemeanours of Flaxborough, leaned from her doorway. "Inspector, a word if you don't mind. They're saying the council's in the soup. Is it true? Because if it is, I'll put it in the window. Civic crisis." "Nothing sells like a crisis." Purbright inclined his head gravely. "I should advise temporary inconvenience, Mrs. Digby. It will sell fewer papers, but make taxpayers less alarmed." Mrs. Digby snorted, unimpressed. "Temporary inconvenience doesn't sell barley sugars," she said, and withdrew with a shake of her curls. Love, as they walked on, asked, "Do you think she knows something, sir?" Purbright smiled at him. "She always knows something, Sergeant. The question is whether it is related to the case at hand or to an incident involving trousers in 1937. Both are possible." By the time they returned to the station, the morning had produced 3 more rumours, each less credible than the last, and one sighting of a suspicious gentleman near the town hall who turned out to be a visiting Methodist minister. The ledger remained absent, but its absence had already begun to draw in the town's imagination like a draught under a door. Purbright, noting each tale without endorsing it, allowed the gossip to weave itself into the fabric of the case. For in Flaxborough, gossip was seldom idle. It was, more often than not, the local form of evidence, half obscured, half revealing, but always useful to a patient man. That afternoon, the rhythm of Flaxborough's daily life beat on with its usual unremarkable regularity, though under the surface there ran a mild but growing excitement. The ledger's disappearance was discussed in the butcher's shop with the same gravity as the price of pork, in the hairdresser's with the same relish as the vicar's new sermon, and in the snug of the Crown and Mitre with a certain satisfaction, as if mischief in the town hall justified several pints more than usual. Inspector Purbright, who had returned to his office with his usual unhurried gait, settled at his desk and opened a notebook. He preferred notes written in his own hand to reports typed by others. Paper gave up its secrets slowly, whereas typing machines rattled as if trying to conclude things too soon. Love, perched opposite, was waiting for the inspector to declare what line of action they might next pursue, though Purbright rarely declared anything before he had wandered around it first. "We might begin," Purbright said at length, "with Mr. Wycherley. A man who has kept accounts for so many years will regard their absence as a kind of insult. He may therefore be more talkative than usual." Love nodded, glad of a concrete plan. "Shall I fetch him in, sir?" "Not yet. We will go to him. People are often more honest in their own habitat, even if they are dishonest in principle." The treasurer's office occupied a narrow suite in the back of the town hall, its windows overlooking the refuse yard. The atmosphere within was one of scrupulous caution. Cupboards locked, drawers labelled, ink bottles aligned in soldierly readiness. Wycherley himself sat behind a desk on which papers were laid like squares in a drafts board. He rose as Purbright entered, his expression that of a man who felt both affronted and vindicated. "Inspector, I cannot convey to you the enormity of this outrage. The ledger, my ledger, vanished as if by sleight of hand. Councillor Phipps consulted me yesterday on lamp standards. The volume was then in its rightful place. I locked it away myself." Purbright, who had the gift of listening without appearing to do more than blink, let Wycherley's indignation run on. "You locked it," he repeated quietly. "And kept the key?" "Always in my pocket," Wycherley assured him. He tapped his waistcoat with emphasis. "It is a rule with me." "Rules," Purbright observed, "are often at their most fragile where pride begins." His tone was mild enough to make the treasurer unsure whether he had been reproached. Wycherley, reddening slightly, continued, "No one could have taken it without deliberate design. This is not theft for gain, Inspector. It is sabotage. Political sabotage. Certain councillors have long been dissatisfied with my insistence on clarity. There are those who prefer an account to be a fog rather than a window." Purbright inclined his head. "You imply a motive, Mr. Wycherley. Motives are delicate things. They must be examined with care." He looked about the office, his eyes resting momentarily on a half-open drawer in which a sheaf of typed sheets protruded. "Might I see those?" Wycherley hesitated, then withdrew the bundle with a sigh. "My working notes, totals, balances, minor references. But, as I've said, the detail, the itemization that proves integrity, is only in the ledger. Without it, I am vulnerable to suggestions. They will say I miscalculated, or worse." Love, standing a pace behind, shifted uncomfortably. The treasurer's distress was palpable, and though he suspected Wycherley to be as tedious as a sermon on bookkeeping, he felt a pang of sympathy. Purbright leafed through the notes, his manner one of polite disinterest. "Do you recall anyone lingering near the case during the adjournment last evening?" Wycherley shook his head emphatically. "The members are too busy with their tea and self-importance. No, if it happened then, it must have been by someone with both the nerve and the practice." "Practice?" Purbright asked gently. Wycherley's lips compressed into a thin line. "Yes, Inspector, a certain facility with substitution. Someone who has rehearsed a change without being noticed. That rowing annual, for example, belonged to Councillor Cranch in his youth. I recognised his hand on the flyleaf at once." The observation, uttered with all the relish of a man who delights in pointing at other men's spots, did not escape Purbright's interest. He replaced the notes on the desk with a soft pat. "Thank you, Mr. Wycherley. We shall, of course, inquire further. Meanwhile, I would be grateful if you would prepare a list of all entries you recall having made in the ledger this quarter. Even imperfect memory may be more reliable than absence." As they left, Love ventured, "Do you think he's right, sir, about the Councillor Cranch?" Purbright's eyes twinkled faintly. "Accusation is a form of self-protection, Sergeant. It tells us more about the accuser than the accused. Still, Cranch's rowing annual does beg the question. How did it come to be in the case at just the right moment? And why?" They stepped back into the town hall corridor where a gaggle of clerks, pretending to be busy with files, clearly hoped to overhear fragments of revelation. Purbright gave them a courteous nod that conveyed nothing. He preferred rumours to grow slowly, like ivy, until they showed their roots. By the time they returned to the station, the afternoon light was beginning to fade. The ledger was still missing, but the space it had left was filling rapidly, with theories, suspicions, and a curious sense that the town itself was holding its breath. Purbright, however, remained unhurried, as though he were listening for something faint. A word dropped, a slip made, a small odd detail that would draw him closer to the truth. The evening before, the extraordinary committee meeting arrived with a sky low and heavy, as though it meant to press down upon Flaxborough's roofs and squeeze out more gossip. Inside the Crown and Mitre, the snug was full, and the subject, as anyone could predict, was not racing tips or the football pools but the vanished ledger. The disappearance had become, within 24 hours, a kind of local entertainment. Respectable citizens discussed it with the sly enthusiasm usually reserved for scandals involving clergy or wills. At a corner table, Councillor Cranch himself sat nursing a whisky, his cigar unlit but waved about with the expressive flourish of a man who liked to look misunderstood. He was holding forth to an audience that consisted largely of himself. "It is absurd," he declared, "that anyone should hint at my involvement. An old rowing annual, eh? Why, that was left behind in a box of books when I gave them to the public library. That is all. It proves nothing, except that the council lacks order in its cupboards." The listeners, a pair of farmers in muddy boots, and a clerk from the borough offices, exchanged polite nods that concealed more than they revealed. In Flaxborough, disbelief was rarely expressed aloud. It was simply recorded, and later recalled at moments most inconvenient for the disbelieved. Inspector Purbright, who had no wish to drink but every wish to observe, had placed himself quietly near the door, pretending to take an interest in the horse-racing page of the Mercury. Love, less successful in pretending, glanced often at Cranch, his expression that of a schoolboy wondering whether to report a classmate's fib. When Cranch rose and made for the counter, Purbright intercepted him with the grace of a man who could stop someone without making it look like an interception. "Good evening, Councillor," he said pleasantly. "I understand you were once a rowing man." Cranch's face registered both pride and alarm, emotions not unfamiliar to each other. Rowing inspector teaches fellow students stamina and teamwork. "Yes, in my youth. I stroked for the Northern Amateurs. Won us a pennant, too. Fine days. But all that's behind me now." Purbright smiled gently. Yet it seems a souvenir of those fine days found its way into the town hall bookcase, where, curiously, the borough accounts should have been. Cranch gave a short laugh, a little too brisk. "Coincidence, Inspector, nothing more. The town hall has been littered with old pamphlets for years. Heaven knows who's responsible." Purbright inclined his head, as if receiving confidence. "Coincidence is a most comfortable companion, Councillor. Still, one wonders why a rowing annual should appear in a case meant only for municipal ledgers. I trust you'll forgive me if I continue to wonder." Cranch's reply was cut short by a call from across the bar. Someone had demanded his opinion on allotment rents, and he moved away gratefully. Purbright watched him go, then folded his newspaper and rose. Love followed, reluctant to leave the snug warmth, but aware that the inspector rarely walked away from nothing. Outside, the evening air carried a tang of chimney, smoke. Love ventured, "He looked rattled, sir. Do you think he did it?" Purbright's tone was mild, almost indulgent. "Rattled people often look guilty, Sergeant. The trick is to discover whether they are guilty of the matter at hand, or simply of being themselves." They walked on through the quiet streets, past curtained windows where families sat to their suppers, and on to the police station. There, in the inspector's office, Purbright sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. The case was still young, but already the little details were accumulating like leaves in a gutter. A misplaced rowing annual, a key that wandered from its peg, a treasurer too indignant for comfort, all small enough in themselves, yet suggestive of human purpose. He let his thoughts settle, then glanced at Love, who was leafing through the day's reports in hope of finding an instruction. Tomorrow evening's meeting will be useful, Sergeant. Not for what is said, but for how it is said. People betray themselves not in their words, but in their order of speaking them. Love nodded earnestly, not entirely grasping the philosophy, but certain it meant something clever. He asked, "And in the meantime, sir?" "In the meantime," Purbright said with a faint smile, "we shall listen. Flaxborough has a way of telling us things, provided we let it think we're not listening at all." And so the night closed in, the town quietly alive with whispers and assumptions, each more colourful than the last. By the time morning broke, anticipation for the extraordinary committee meeting had spread as wide as the mist across the market square. Inspector Purbright, unhurried as always, was content to let the town prepare itself for its own revelations. The following evening arrived with a drizzle that gave the cobblestones of the market square a sheen of weary polish. Lamps blinked into life, casting small halos of authority outside the town hall, which stood rather like an elderly solicitor obliged to stay open later than was decent. Inside, the extraordinary meeting of the Amenities Committee was already gathering weight, not so much from decisions to be made as from the expectations of those who had come to watch. The public gallery, usually populated by no more than the allotment woman and the retired postmaster, now held a respectable throng. Tradesmen, two of the town's schoolmistresses, and Mrs. Digby from the newsagents, who had secured a front seat in order to make sure her own account for the Mercury would be more vivid than the reporters. They whispered with a shared excitement, like congregants before a sermon rumoured to contain scandal. On the main floor, the councillors arranged themselves with an air of righteousness that none wholly felt. Councillor Cranch, resplendent in a waistcoat one button too ambitious for his midsection, tried to look unconcerned but failed by the frequency with which he tapped his cigar against his teeth. Mrs. Plimpton, chairing with pearls and pursed lips, surveyed the assembly as if expecting both apology and admiration. Beside her sat Mr. Wycherley, the treasurer, pale and drawn, his notes stacked like fortifications. When Inspector Purbright entered, accompanied by Sergeant Love, a ripple of attention moved through the room. Purbright acknowledged it with a slight bow that suggested both gratitude and mild surprise that anyone should notice him. He and Love took seats to one side, where observation could be achieved without intrusion. Mrs. Plimpton rapped the table with a gavel she had purchased herself, convinced that an air of ceremony improved authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "we meet under unfortunate circumstances. The disappearance of the borough ledger is not merely a matter of bookkeeping, it is a matter of public trust. We must be seen to act decisively." There was a murmur of approval from the gallery, though mixed with coughs of scepticism. Purbright sat calmly, eyes moving from face to face, noting who looked defensive, who looked eager, and who looked entirely too comfortable. Wycherley cleared his throat and rose, holding his notes as though they were both shield and sword. "I have endeavoured to reconstruct from memory and from separate sheets the principal balances for the quarter. However, without the detailed entries, these accounts remain vulnerable to misinterpretation. Certain members of this committee may well seize upon the absence to insinuate errors, or worse, impropriety." His gaze flicked, not very subtly, in the direction of Cranch. Cranch shifted, half rising. "I will not sit here and be slandered by implication. If you have evidence, the treasurer produce it. If not, keep your insinuations for the pigeonholes of your office." The exchange produced a rustle of delight from the gallery, as if the promised scandal had arrived sooner than expected. Purbright, however, did not so much as blink. He observed how Mrs. Plimpton raised a hand to silence the squabble, but her eyes betrayed a glimmer of satisfaction. "Gentlemen," she said crisply, "the public will not tolerate bickering. What it expects are facts." She turned with a solemn smile towards Purbright. "Inspector, perhaps you will enlighten us as to your inquiries." Purbright rose slowly, a mild figure against the stiff-backed councillors. He did not thunder, he merely spoke as though inviting the room to think along with him. "As yet, the matter remains an inquiry, not a conclusion. The ledger, being a substantial volume, could not vanish of its own accord. Its removal required opportunity, access, and purpose. We know the opportunity existed, for the case was unattended at intervals. Access to is plain. Keys may be borrowed, cupboards left imperfectly secured. Purpose, however, is the more interesting question. Councillors waved this, some annoyed, others curious. Cranch, under the gallery's collective stare, bristled like a dog sniffing an approaching stick. Purbright continued with quiet firmness. I would ask each member to consider this. Whoever removed the ledger did not destroy the evidence of its absence. Instead, something was put in its place, a rowing annual of no particular value belonging once to Councillor Cranch. Why substitute one book for another? Why not leave the shelf empty? A silence fell that was broken only by the creak of benches as people leaned forward. Purbright allowed the question to hover, not demanding an answer but letting it work its way through minds. He then inclined his head. These are matters I shall pursue further. For tonight, I suggest only that haste in judgment often obscures the truth. The ledger is gone, yes, but the motives for its removal remain here, among us. With that he sat down, the faintest trace of amusement softening his face as he noticed how the councillors shifted uncomfortably, each suddenly aware of how they might appear to their neighbours. The meeting continued with the usual resolutions, postponements, assurances, the promising of inquiries that would almost certainly never be finished, but the heart of it had been Purbright's gentle statement. In the gallery, speculation now turned to whispered accusations. Mrs. Digby, already composing tomorrow's headline in her mind, smiled like a cat among inattentive birds. When at last the gavel fell to close proceedings, the councillors left with stiff politeness, each one anxious to appear above suspicion. Cranch departed first, cigar now firmly clamped between his teeth. Wycherley lingered to stack his papers with exaggerated care. Mrs. Plimpton basked in the role of civic saviour, though her pearls trembled faintly as if sensing the unease beneath her composure. Outside, as the drizzle thickened, Purbright and Love paused beneath the gas lamp. "You gave them nothing certain, sir," Love remarked, "yet they all looked as if you'd accused each one in turn." Purbright smiled gently. "A curious thing, Sergeant. When a man feels the need to defend himself from an accusation not made, one begins to suspect what he thinks others already know." Love blinked at this, trying to unravel it, but Purbright was already walking on, his pace unhurried. Somewhere within that chamber, he knew, the guilty had stirred uneasily. All that remained was to let time and human nature do their work, and to be ready when the next ripple disturbed Flaxborough's calm surface. The following morning brought with it a freshness that seemed at odds with the lingering unease of the night before. The market square bustled with the usual traffic of carts, gossip and deliveries, but beneath the ordinary murmur there was an added sharpness, as if every shopkeeper and passer-by had an opinion about what Inspector Purbright had meant, or not meant, at the committee meeting. By breakfast, the Mercury had already given its interpretation. "Police cast. Wide net," the headline announced, accompanied by a breathless column that implied the inspector had all but accused half the council of embezzlement. Mrs. Digby's handiwork was apparent. She had woven fragments of his careful speech into a web of suggestions so neatly that the casual reader would never notice what had actually been said. At the police station, Love was already brimming with the energy of scandal. "They've taken it as gospel, sir. Half the town saying Cranch was caught red-handed, the other half that Wycherley's been fiddling figures for years, and Mrs. Plimpton, well, she's walking about like she's just been crowned queen." Purbright folded the paper with a mild expression, as though considering whether it might be more useful for wrapping fish. "When everyone is certain," he said quietly, "the truth is usually still wandering about in its slippers." He spent the morning listening to the steady trickle of reports. One clerk recalled seeing Cranch near the case on the afternoon before the meeting. Just glancing, mind you, nothing suspicious. Another swore that Wycherley had been in a frightful state all week, muttering about figures that didn't add up. And from the caretaker Doughty came the plaintive confession that, for the second time in recent weeks, he had found the cupboard door on the landing ajar when it should have been tight shut. Each piece by itself was small, yet together they made a muddle that refused to settle into order. By noon, Purbright suggested to Love that they tour the city. The inspector always believed that fresh air loosened both tongues and minds. They passed through the square where stalls clattered with trade and paused by the library steps. There, as though by design, stood Councillor Cranch, deep in conversation with a thin, fidgeting man Purbright recognised as Mr. Phipps, another committee member known for his habit of objecting to anything not already proposed by himself. Cranch saw them and stiffened, though his attempt at geniality was prompt. "Inspector, Sergeant. Out on patrol, eh? Nothing to see here but honest conversation between colleagues." Purbright bowed his head politely. "One always learns something from honest conversation, Counsellor. I trust you and Mr. Phipps find much to agree upon this morning." Phipps flushed as though caught stealing biscuits. "Merely discussing lamp standards," he said hastily. "Entirely civic matter, Inspector." "Of course," Purbright murmured, letting his eyes linger just long enough to make both men uneasy. Then he continued on, leaving behind two counsellors who looked rather like boys found loitering where they shouldn't. Love, once they were out of earshot, could not keep silent. "It's Cranch again, sir. He's fair twitching whenever you're near him. Why not press him harder?" "Because, Sergeant," Purbright replied gently, "a man who twitches so readily will either hang himself with his own words or reveal who steadies his hand. Either outcome requires patience." The afternoon brought a small development that, to most, would have seemed trivial. A messenger from the Borough Printing Works arrived with a parcel, addressed to the Treasurer's office but misdelivered to the station in error. Inside were proofs of posters advertising the forthcoming spring flower show. But tucked between the sheets, unnoticed until Purbright spread them out, was a small slip of paper, an offcut bearing neat figures in ink, a rough copy of sums that seemed suspiciously like council entries. Wycherley was summoned at once. He paled when he saw the slip. "These are mine, but not mine. I mean, I write my accounts carefully in ledgers, never on scraps. This is some half-done imitation. A forgery, Inspector, crude as it is. Someone means to suggest that I have been working in secret off the books." Purbright studied the figures with a calm eye. The numbers, though clumsy, bore a certain resemblance to Wycherley's careful hand. Enough, perhaps, to mislead someone eager to believe in irregularity. He said nothing, but folded the slip neatly and placed it in his file. As dusk settled again over Flaxborough, the inspector sat in his office, weighing the day's findings. The ledger had not reappeared, but the manner of its absence was beginning to suggest more than carelessness. Substitution, forgery, and now a trail of paper drifting where it ought not be. Someone, he reflected, was building a story, not merely hiding a book. Love, watching him, finally asked, "Do you think they mean to ruin Wycherley, sir?" Purbright leaned back, his face unreadable. "Possibly, Sergeant. Or possibly they mean to ruin someone else, using Wycherley as the shadow. Either way, the truth will out. It always does, though it prefers to wait until we've all been made uncomfortable." And with that, the inspector closed his notebook, the faintest flicker of interest alive in his eyes, as though the missing ledger had begun, at last, to speak in its own silence. The morning after the strange discovery in the parcel of printing proofs arrived pale and wind-blown, the kind of weather that encouraged townsfolk to linger in shops longer than necessary, so they might carry home scraps of gossip with their bread or lamp oil. By now, the disappearance of the ledger had moved from being a curiosity to being a declared scandal. Every man or woman in Flaxborough had assigned blame somewhere, with about as much certainty as they apportioned weather predictions. To some, Wycherley was guilty of sly bookkeeping. To others, Cranch was clearly plotting a cover-up. And for a few with a taste for melodrama, the ledger was said to have been stolen by outsiders, though what strangers could possibly want with the borough's financial minutiae was left unexplained. Inspector Purbright, immune as ever to popular theories, walked from the station towards the library, where he had asked the librarian to set aside any odd donations of books that had recently come her way. His gait was unhurried, but his eyes, behind their mildness, missed little. At his side, Sergeant Love kept a pace that betrayed his eagerness. He was convinced that the scrap of imitation figures hidden among the flower show posters must be a clue planted by someone desperate to frame Wycherley. The possibility thrilled him with its neatness. The librarian, Miss Peat, a thin woman with spectacles so round they gave her a perpetually astonished look, received them at the counter. "Inspector," she said in her careful papery voice, "you asked if I had seen any volumes that seemed misplaced. Well, 2 days ago, a box of books was delivered anonymously. Nothing unusual in that. People often treat us as a clearing-house for their attics. But what caught my eye was that among a set of gardening pamphlets, there was a church accounts ledger from another parish entirely, 17th century, most valuable. Purbright examined the book, running a finger along the cracked leather. And you have no record of who brought them? None, she admitted with a faint frown. But there was a cart parked outside just after the box appeared. Belonged to Councillor Phipps, unless I'm mistaken. He's in the habit of borrowing gardening books for his roses, though why he should deposit anything I cannot say. Love blinked. Phipps, sir? He was the one we saw muttering with Cranch yesterday. Purbright gave no outward sign of excitement, merely replaced the ledger gently on the counter. It is a curious coincidence, Miss Pete. I am obliged to you. When they left the library, Love was fairly brimming with certainty. That's it, sir. Phipps must have been the one who swapped the rowing book for the accounts ledger, only he bungled it. Perhaps he meant to hide the real ledger in the box but left the wrong one by mistake. Perhaps, Purbright said evenly, or perhaps he wished for it to be noticed. Accidents in Flaxborough have a suspicious habit of arriving on time. They strolled on, the inspector pausing to admire the ironwork of a lamp-post with a deliberation that baffled his sergeant. In truth, Purbright was thinking about the curious pattern forming, one book substituted for another, a slip of forged figures appearing where it had no business, and now an old church ledger surfacing at the library with the shadow of Phipps nearby. It was less covert work than stage management. Someone, he reflected, wanted the appearance of muddle, not merely the fact of disappearance. That afternoon he called at Councillor Phipps's modest villa on the edge of town. The garden, even in early spring, showed the fussiness of a man who preferred roses to people. Phipps himself received them with the harried manner of one interrupted in the middle of composing objections. "You'll be here about the meeting," he said quickly, before Purbright had spoken. "I had no part in that nonsense about the ledger, Inspector. That's Cranch's doing, mark my words. He's been muttering about changes to the treasurer's post for months. Once his man in the chair, that's what this is all about." Purbright listened without interruption, as though the words were pieces of furniture he was content to let arrange themselves. At length, he asked mildly, "And yet your cart was seen by the library steps the day a certain box of books was left?" Phipps's eyes flickered. "Library? Oh, yes, I often call there. Must have dropped some old pamphlets. The house was cluttered with them. Nothing more sinister than that." "Among them," Purbright observed gently, "was a church accounts ledger. Unusual thing to part with, unless you wish to suggest an association between ledgers and libraries." Phipps blustered. "Coincidence, Inspector, coincidence, nothing more." Purbright inclined his head as though accepting the explanation at face value. Yet when they departed, he remarked softly to Love, "Coincidence again, Sergeant. One might almost think the town had more coincidences than clocks." That evening news spread of a second discovery. Mr. Doughty, the caretaker, had found a torn page on the town hall landing, crumpled behind the umbrella stand. It bore figures in the same clumsy hand as the slip in the poster parcel. He handed it over with an air of wounded dignity, as though the building itself had betrayed him. Purbright studied it in his office under the yellow light of the desk lamp. The ink was fresh, the sums incomplete. Love leaned over eagerly. "The same forger, sir. They must have been copying entries, trying to invent a version of the ledger." Purbright gave a slow nod. "Indeed, and yet they scatter their work as though they wished it to be found. A thief who hides nothing has a purpose beyond theft." He closed the file and sat back, his face composed but his mind alert. The picture was broadening, though not yet sharp. Someone within the council had engineered not merely the disappearance of a ledger, but the appearance of confusion, planted scraps, misplaced books, forged sums. It was a pattern not of concealment but of suggestion, as though the town itself were being coaxed to a particular conclusion. Before leaving for the night, he wrote in his notebook a single line: "Who benefits if Wycherley falls?" The answer, he suspected, would not be found in figures but in the subtler currency of position, rivalry, and the peculiar satisfactions of small-town politics. As he extinguished the lamp, Love asked hesitantly, "Do you think we're close, sir?" Purbright gave the faintest of smiles in the dimness. "Close, Sergeant, but not enough to breathe on it. The truth dislikes eagerness. Best we let it come to us in its own time." And outside, Flaxborough's lamps glimmered on the wet pavements, while behind the curtained windows, councillors, clerks and busybodies rehearsed their alibis in tones meant only for themselves. Unaware that each careful word was one more bead on the thread, Inspector Purbright was slowly, patiently stringing together. The next morning broke with a watery sun that lit the rooftops of Flaxborough without managing to warm them. The town, however, was already warm with speculation. Mrs. Digby had devoted the front window of her shop to the latest Mercury headline, "Mysterious Figures Found, Forger at Work," and underneath had arranged a row of ledgers borrowed from her husband's old business as a theatrical display. Passers-by stopped to peer, shake their heads wisely and move on, confident they had added another crumb of certainty to their growing theories. At the police station, Purbright sat in his chair with his usual air of gentle detachment, though his eyes rested thoughtfully on the papers before him. He had arranged the scraps, the imitation accounts from the printing works, the torn page from the town hall landing, and compared them with the neat figures copied in Wycherley's own hand. The differences were plain to him, yet it was not the handwriting itself that interested him most, but the manner of its discovery. Every fragment had been left where it might be found, like a trail of breadcrumbs carefully scattered for the benefit of the gullible. Sergeant Love entered with a briskness that suggested he had been listening outside the post office again. "Morning, sir. There's talk everywhere now. Half the market reckons Wycherley's guilty. The other half says it's Cranch. Nobody's putting money on Phipps, though, except the butcher, and he'll lay a bet on anything." Purbright folded his hands over the desk. "The butcher is often a better judge of men than he is of meat, Sergeant. But what interests me is not who is blamed, but who is content to watch others be blamed." Love frowned, not sure if this was a riddle. "You mean someone's happy to let Wycherley take the fall?" "Or Cranch," Purbright said mildly. "Or anyone else sufficiently loud to draw attention. The more voices cry guilt, the less one hears the quiet voice that points to motive." They were interrupted by a knock on the office door. Mr. Wycherley himself entered, pale, agitated, and clutching his hat as if it were the only solid thing left to him. "Inspector," he began, "I cannot endure this smear a moment longer. Yesterday a man stopped me in the street and asked how much I'd pocketed from the Lamp Standard accounts. Me, as if I had ever mislaid a penny of borough funds. This cannot go on. If you do not find the ledger, my position is untenable." Purbright gestured gently for him to sit. "We shall find it, Mr. Wycherley. The question is not only where it is, but why it is gone. Tell me, do you have any reason to suppose anyone benefits directly from your discredit?" Wycherley blinked in wounded surprise. "Benefit? I cannot see who, unless it is those who resent my diligence. I have refused certain expenses, questioned certain claims. Natural enemies for a treasurer, I suppose. Councillor Cranch in particular has pressed me hard over allocations to his precious rowing club." "Ah," Purbright said, his tone neutral, "rowing again." Wycherley mistook his calm for agreement and leaned forward. "Yes, rowing again. The man cannot forget his youth, forever finding ways to dress it up as a civic duty. If you ask me, Inspector, that annual of his found in the case is no accident." When Wycherley had gone, Love remarked, "He sounds almost desperate to pin it on Cranch." "Desperation, Sergeant," Purbright replied softly, "is like steam. It obscures the glass, but does not alter the view. Still, we must allow for the possibility that Wycherley's indignation is not entirely theatrical." Later that day, Purbright and Love walked to the Crown and Mitre, where councillors were known to take their lunch. Sure enough, they found Cranch holding court at a corner table, cigar smoke wreathing about his head like doubtful glory. At his elbow sat Phipps, nodding with nervous energy. Cranch greeted Purbright with a hearty bonhomie show. "Inspector, come join us. We were just saying how disgraceful it is that a town like ours should suffer such incompetence. Imagine, ledgers disappearing, and the treasurer behaved as though he were blameless." Purbright accepted a chair, though he made no move to order refreshment. "One cannot help wondering," he said with polite calm, "how the treasurer might have misplaced such a substantial volume without assistance. Unless, of course, the removal was intended to embarrass him." Phipps coughed and stared at his plate. Cranch chuckled heartily. "Embarrass? If the man embarrasses himself, it's no fault of ours. Still, I wouldn't be surprised if he had reason to keep certain figures out of sight." Purbright smiled faintly. "An accusation is rather like an arrow, Councillor. One must be sure of the target before releasing it. Otherwise it has a habit of circling back." Cranch shifted in his seat, puffing more vigorously at his cigar. Phipps, seizing the chance to appear useful, added, "If you ask me, Inspector, the whole matter could be solved if you searched Wycherley's house. If the ledger isn't in the town hall, it's bound to be somewhere close at hand." Purbright regarded him with mild interest. "Bound to be? That is a certainty worth noting, Councillor." He rose, bowing slightly. I shall not detain you gentlemen further. Good day." As he and Love walked back through the market square, Love muttered, "They're trying to push it all on Wycherley now, sir. First Cranch denies everything. Now Phipps is hiding the ledgers in his house." "Indeed," Purbright replied. "When several men are eager to point at the same scapegoat, one must ask whether they are herding him to the slaughter or protecting something behind him." The following morning provided a fresh ripple in the pond. Mrs. Plimpton, immaculate as ever, arrived at the station in person. She carried herself with the air of one bestowing both favour and burden. "Inspector," she announced, "I feel it my duty to inform you of certain irregularities I have long suspected in Mr. Wycherley's conduct. While I do not accuse directly, I must confess to having found his manner evasive on several occasions when I inquired about committee expenses. I fear the public's confidence is badly shaken. Something decisive must be done." Purbright thanked her with his usual civility, though once she had departed he sat in silence for some minutes. Love finally ventured. "She's convinced as well, sir. That makes 3 of them pressing the same point." Purbright's gaze lingered on the scraps of forged figures pinned neatly on his desk. "Yes, Sergeant. One begins to suspect that the disappearance of the ledger was less about hiding figures than about displaying suspicion. The performance is almost too well rehearsed." That evening, as rain tapped on the station windows, Purbright reviewed the chain of events in his notebook. A book substituted for a ledger. Forged scraps planted like seeds. Councillors whispering together, then speaking aloud with convenient certainty. Even Mrs. Plimpton, always eager to appear the guardian of civic virtue, had played her part. It was a tapestry of appearances, and appearances, he reflected, were the one thing in Flaxborough never left to chance. When he closed the book at last, he said quietly to Love, "The guilty party is not the one who talks most, Sergeant, but the one who ensures others do the talking. We are being led. The question is, towards whom, and for whose advantage?" Love stared, wide-eyed. "Do you mean the ledger itself might not matter?" Purbright allowed himself the faintest smile. "On the contrary, Sergeant, the ledger matters greatly, but not for the sums it holds, for the shadows it throws." And with that the inspector extinguished the lamp, leaving the office in quiet darkness, while outside Flaxborough's narrow streets muttered with their customary mixture of rain and rumour, each whisper nudging the investigation closer to its hidden centre. The following day dawned over Flaxborough with a brightness that promised improvement, though the townsfolk were not inclined to see it so. By now the ledger had achieved a notoriety quite beyond its sober purpose. The milkman, delivering his morning rounds, heard more than one doorway demand whether he had heard the latest. In the drapery, ladies lingered by the counter longer than custom required, whispering suspicions with the same relish they applied to evaluating fabrics. Every errand had become a chance to spread or collect fragments of theory, each one delivered with the assurance of gospel. Inspector Purbright, however, remained untroubled by the town's rising excitement. He entered the station with his usual calm, nodded to the constable at the desk, and went directly to his office, where Sergeant Love already sat with a pile of clippings and notes he had collected. Love looked up eagerly as Purbright removed his coat. "Morning, sir. It's spreading like wildfire. Everyone's against Wycherley now. The Mercury's got another piece about hidden accounts, and even suggests auditors might be called from outside. Wycherley's reputation won't survive if this keeps up." Purbright seated himself and began filling his pipe, giving no outward sign of alarm. "Reputations in Flaxborough are rather like flower beds, Sergeant. They are trampled in spring and admired in summer depending on who has been digging. What interests me is the sudden unanimity. You recall how quickly suspicion turned towards Wycherley once the forged scraps began to appear?" Love nodded earnestly, almost as if someone wanted it that way. "Just so. We must therefore ask ourselves what those scraps were meant to accomplish. They do not conceal anything. Indeed, they reveal themselves too readily. A hamisitvani, amalieta kalasra tervistek elretetek. A forgery meant to direct is displayed." Before Love could answer, there came a timid knock. Mr. Duty, the caretaker, entered, his cap in hand and his brow creased with discomfort. "Beg pardon, Inspector, but I thought you ought to know. Something odd this morning at the hall. When I opened up, I found the door to the council chamber half ajar, though I'm sure I locked it last night. Nothing taken, far as I can tell, but one of the window catches was loose. It looked as though it had been meddled with." Purbright regarded him gently. "You're certain you locked up, Mr. Duty?" "Aye, sir. Never leave without checking. I've been a caretaker for 22 years and never had a complaint. This time, though, someone's been in. I can feel it." "Thank you," Purbright said softly. "Your feeling may be more reliable than the evidence of locks." When the man had gone, Love exclaimed, "They're after it again, sir. Whoever took the ledger may have been back to move it, or perhaps to plant more scraps." "Perhaps," Purbright agreed, "but there is another possibility, that the intrusion was only meant to be noticed. A burglary without theft has its own message." That afternoon, Purbright visited Mrs. Plimpton. She received him in her sitting room, where lace curtains and framed photographs of long-departed aldermen gave an air of civic piety. She was gracious, though faintly expectant, as though the inspector had arrived to confirm her own judgment. "I fear, Inspector," she began, "that the town cannot endure much more of this uncertainty. People are beginning to say dreadful things about our administration. I am convinced the only sensible course is to demand Wycherley's resignation. Surely you must. See, he is the common factor in all this." Purbright listened politely, his expression unchanging. "It is a view much discussed, Alderman, but I would like to ask, have you personally seen anything irregular in his work?" Mrs. Plimpton paused, then smiled with the careful sweetness of one who will not be cornered. "Not irregular, no, but he has always been so precise. Too precise, if you take my meaning. Such men are often hiding something beneath their neatness, and of course the council must guard against even the appearance of impropriety." Purbright inclined his head and rose, thanking her for her time. As he left, her eyes followed him with faint suspicion, as though she doubted his ability to deliver the conclusion she so obviously desired. Back at the station, Love was waiting with fresh news. "Sir, there's been a flare-up in the market square. Someone shouted at Wycherley that he ought to be locked up, and the poor man nearly fainted. Had to be helped away by a constable. If this keeps up, I don't know how long he'll last." Purbright took off his hat slowly, placing it on the desk. "Then perhaps, Sergeant, it is time to test our actors more directly." That evening he sent Love a discreet message to Councillor Phipps, requesting his presence at the station. Phipps arrived promptly, nervous and perspiring despite the cool air. Purbright received him kindly, as though they were old acquaintances discussing a parish fete. "Councillor," he said, "I should like your recollection of the evening the ledger vanished. You were in the chamber, were you not?" Phipps nodded hastily. Yes. I was there with the others, but I saw nothing amiss. The treasurer himself admitted he couldn't produce the book." Purbright leaned forward slightly, his tone courteous but pointed. "And yet your cart was seen at the library steps the following morning, at the very moment a box of books, including a redundant ledger, was delivered anonymously. A curious sequence, don't you think?" Phipps coloured. "Merely a coincidence, Inspector. Old pamphlets from my study, nothing more. That church ledger must have slipped in by mistake. I'd never even noticed it." Purbright regarded him with gentle amusement. "Coincidence is becoming something of a theme in this matter, Councillor. But tell me, why go to the trouble of planting scraps of forged accounts in places where they would be found? Unless, of course, one wished to persuade the town of a particular story." Phipps opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally managed, "I don't know what you mean. This whole business has nothing to do with me." He rose abruptly, muttered a farewell, and departed before further questions could pin him down. Love, watching him go, said, "He's rattled, sir." That was as good as a confession. Purbright shook his head gently. "No, Sergeant. A confession is plain. What we have seen is fear. A fear not of the crime itself, but of being left holding the appearance of it." As night fell, the inspector sat once more at his desk, pipe smoke curling in the lamplight. The scraps of forged figures lay neatly arranged before him, and beside them the note from Doughty about the tampered window. He considered the web forming around Wycherley, each thread carefully placed by someone who preferred to remain unseen. Councillors whispered, the public roared, and reputations shifted like sand. Yet the true hand behind it all had not yet revealed itself. He wrote one more line in his notebook. The guilt requires not concealment, but spectacle. Then he closed the book with a quiet finality, his face serene. For Purbright, the pieces were aligning. All that remained was the next small incident, the inevitable slip, the overeager gesture that would nudge the guilty into full view. The following day arrived with a restless energy in Flaxborough. The ordinary rhythm of shopping and errands seemed overlaid with a sense of anticipation, as though the town were waiting for the next act in a play that had already provided more amusement than most local entertainments. Children were overheard repeating garbled versions of events in the market square, and respectable men in bowler hats stopped one another with earnest whispers that suggested far greater matters than a missing ledger were at stake. What made it more peculiar was that no one quite knew what they were waiting for, only that something must surely happen soon. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, preserved his usual calm. He spent the morning reviewing the fragments of the case with the patience of a man rearranging chess pieces until the board itself revealed its design. The substitution of Cranch's rowing annual, the convenient scraps of forged figures, the planted ledger in the library box, the tampered town hall window, all were elements that did not obscure the truth but pointed towards a deliberate performance. The question that occupied him was not simply who had engineered it, but why they had chosen such a noisy method. A thief seeks silence, an intriguer seeks applause. Sergeant Love filed a report giving the first ripple of the day. "Sir," he said, laying a paper on the desk, "this morning one of the clerks swears he saw Councillor Cranch slipping a bundle of papers into his case after the meeting last night. Said the papers looked like ledger pages, though he didn't dare say anything at the time." Purbright raised his eyes slowly from the desk. "Ah, a bundle of papers described but not examined. That is precisely the sort of rumour our friends would hope for. Did the clerk happen to mention where Cranch was heading?" "To the Crown and Mitre, as usual," Love replied. "Apparently he was boasting about new club subscriptions not half an hour later." The inspector smiled faintly. "Then the bundle was unlikely to have been the borough's conscience. Cranch has many faults, but carrying official papers into a tavern where he cannot resist display would be clumsier than even he intends. Still, the rumour will do its work." They were interrupted by the arrival of a constable, who announced that Mrs. Plimpton had summoned Purbright to her home at once. Suppressing a sigh of resignation, he allowed himself to be conducted back into the drizzle. Mrs. Plimpton greeted him at the door with the solemnity of a woman unveiling a monument. "Inspector," she began, leading him to her parlour, "I have this very morning received an anonymous letter. It accuses Wycherley of having kept a private copy of the ledger at his home. I felt it my duty, of course, to show you at once." She produced the letter from a silver tray. The writing was blocky, awkward, and clearly disguised. It claimed that Wycherley had grown fearful of being discovered, and had removed the ledger himself to conceal the irregularities. He urged his house to be searched immediately. Purbright read it without expression, then folded it neatly. "And how did you receive this?" "Through the letterbox not 2 hours ago. No envelope, just the sheet itself, folded twice." Purbright thanked her, pocketed the letter, and departed without offering the reaction she craved. As he and Love walked away, the sergeant muttered, "That's the third push against Wycherley, sir. First Cranch, then Phipps, now Plimpton. All different routes, all pointing the same way." "Indeed," Purbright said quietly. "So much agreement is almost refreshing. Were Wycherley truly guilty, they would not need to persuade us so industriously." Back at the station, he studied the letter again. The awkward capitals were not the work of a natural forger, but of someone convinced that disguise alone would suffice. The timing was telling. The town was already murmuring about Cranch's supposed bundle of papers, and there was a convenient deflection, turning suspicion back onto the treasurer. It was orchestration, not a hand of panic. That evening, Purbright and Love attended a civic reception at the Corn Exchange, a function scheduled long before the ledger vanished but now swollen with the curiosity of those hoping for fresh revelations. The hall glittered with chandeliers whose bulbs hummed faintly. The air smelled of polish, carnations, and slightly stale sandwiches. Councillors mingled with townsfolk, each eyeing the other with a wariness disguised as cordiality. Purbright moved gently among them, never pressing, always listening. He noted how Cranch avoided Wycherley altogether, how Phipps lingered near Mrs. Plimpton, as though eager for her approval, and how Wycherley himself, pale and strained, clutched a glass of sherry as if it were the only solid thing keeping him upright. Then came the set-piece the evening seemed destined to provide. As the mayor began a pompous speech about civic pride, a commotion erupted near the side of the hall. A small parcel had been found tucked beneath one of the buffet tables. The wrapping was brown paper, the string tied in a way that seemed deliberately careless. When opened, it revealed several torn pages, mock ledger entries, unmistakably in the same clumsy hand as before. A murmur ran through the hall, swelling into gasps. "Evidence!" someone whispered loudly. "More proof against the treasurer!" Cranch, seizing the moment, raised his voice. "There, Inspector. Will you still pretend Wycherley has nothing to answer? The proof multiplies by the day." All eyes turned to Purbright. He stepped forward, bent over the parcel, and examined the sheets with quiet deliberation. Then, instead of addressing Cranch, he looked at the crowd. His voice, though mild, carried clearly. "Curious, is it not, that such scraps are always found where many may witness them? Rarely hidden, always displayed. A guilty man hides, a schemer parades. Perhaps we should ask who benefits most from the parade." The words settled over the hall like a sudden draught, silencing the whispers. Purbright replaced the pages carefully and straightened, his expression unreadable. The mayor stumbled through the remainder of his speech, and the applause afterwards was half-hearted. Yet the set piece had achieved its effect. Suspicion had been sharpened, but not in the direction Cranch desired. Instead, the town now had reason to wonder why the supposed proof against Wycherley kept arriving in such a theatrical manner. Later, as Purbright and Love walked back through the damp streets, Love said, "You turned it on them, sir. They'll think twice before pushing more scraps our way." Purbright shook his head gently. "On the contrary, Sergeant. I expect they will press harder. A performance once begun must be carried to its end. The danger lies in their eagerness. It is when the curtain is snatched too quickly that one sees the hand behind the scene." He paused beneath a lamp-post, the drizzle silvering his hat. "We must be ready. The next act will not be long delayed, and it will be noisier still." By the following afternoon the town had worked itself into an appetite for consequence. A murmur ran through offices and shops that the police were doing something at the town hall, which in Flaxborough was a phrase that covered anything from dusting to revolution. Shortly before 4, a modest notice appeared on the chamber door. "Inventory reconciliation. Members may attend." It was the sort of wording that put the innocent to sleep and pricked the guilty like a pin. By 10 past, the public rail was dotted with familiar faces pretending to be lost on their way to elsewhere. Mrs. Digby installed herself with the air of a journalist who had discovered Parliament. Councillor Cranch drifted in wearing borrowed gravity. Phipps followed, already perspiring. And Mrs. Plimpton took the chair by right, pearls firm as policy. Inspector Purbright stood near the glass-fronted bookcase as though mildly interested in its carpentry. He had asked for the chamber to be exactly as it had been on the evening of the ledger's disappearance. Lamps lit, case clock wound, keys to cupboards present and accounted for. Sergeant Love at the back looked as taut as a drum, which is to say ready to be struck. "Thank you for coming," Purbright said, and the calm of his tone settled the room more efficiently than any gavel. "I propose a small demonstration of how easily appearances can be arranged, and how easily they may mislead." He nodded to Mr. Doughty. The caretaker produced with ceremonial reluctance the key to the bookcase and unlocked the doors. On the middle shelf, as before, the Blue Rowing Annual sat in prim absurdity. "You will remember," Purbright continued, "that this annual was found in the place where the borough ledger ought to be. At first glance, a substitution of books, but when one looks a little harder, here, for example." He lifted the shelf, easing its pegs from their sockets. A grey lip of dust showed a higher line, the ghost of an earlier setting. "This shelf was lowered recently," he said, "not to make room for something on it, but to make room beneath it." He set the shelf aside and, to several small intakes of breath, knelt to run his fingers along the case's inner base. "The cabinet maker has been kinder to us than the thief. He left a finger plate at the back. One presses here, so." A section of the base flexed and came up like the lid of a very decorous trap. From within, wrapped in a municipal tea towel, rose a thick brown-backed volume. Purbright lifted it with both hands and laid it on the table. Even closed, the ledger had the uncompromising dignity of an honest book. The room made the sound that rooms make when people want to cheer and don't dare. Love let out only a fraction of his breath. "Mr. Doughty," Purbright said gently, "did you know of this compartment?" "Never, sir," the caretaker said, horrified and fascinated in equal measure. "Never in all my days." Purbright opened the ledger at random. The brown ink marched on, neat as soldiers, paper dust lifted like a prayer. He shut it again and looked up, the faintest smile on his lips as if the book had told a joke only he had heard. "There has never been a burglary," he said. There has been a performance." Mrs. Plimpton's pearls gave a tiny shiver. "But how? Who?" "In due order," Purbright replied. "First, access. The bookcase key is usually on a peg in the landing cupboard. On a certain evening during tea adjournment, the key was not on its peg. We were assured it never leaves Mr. Doughty, save when he boils his eggs, at which times it rests in the cupboard. On the rim of that cupboard, I noticed a shallow mark in the dust and what I thought then might be polish, an almost invisible smear. I asked Mr. Doughty to keep his cleaning cloth from that evening. It carried the faint scent not of polish, but of grafting wax." Phipps made an involuntary movement, quickly stilled. Purbright's tone, however, neither quickened nor hardened. Grafting wax, Sergeant Love discovered, is commonly used by rose enthusiasts to seal cuts and set new stock. It takes an excellent imprint and softens obligingly in a teacup. A landing cupboard, briefly visited while eggs boiled and chairs were straightened, makes a passable workbench. Next, substitution. A man who wished to direct suspicion might put into the gap a book that speaks of another man. Councillor Cranch's rowing annual, inscribed in a youthful hand, proved admirably eloquent. It did not accuse, it merely suggested. And suggestion, as I have found, is a more obedient servant than proof. Cranch cleared his throat explosively. "If this is to be a slander—" "On the contrary," Purbright said, "it is a description. Councillor, someone borrowed your past to decorate his present." A faint guilty titter rose from the rail and collapsed. Purbright continued, still in that unhurried voice which, somehow, drew tighter the thread. Then the scraps. Forged figures tucked among flower show proofs and beneath a buffet table. One of them, you will observe, written on off-cut paper trimmed by our borough printing works. The committee member most active with the flower show, and most likely to have business at the press, is Councillor Phipps. The anonymous ledger was placed among a box of pamphlets at the library, observed by Miss Peat on the very morning Councillor Phipps's cart was outside. That ledger, of course, was not ours. It served only to echo the word and implant the picture. The window catch tampered, just enough to be noticed, not enough to be used. An anonymous letter to Alderman Plimpton, urgently advising a search of Mr. Wycherley's house, written in capitals by a hand that knows letters but not discretion. At each turn an appearance was delivered that would do most to persuade. None of it hid a crime, it displayed a story. Phipps wiped his brow with a handkerchief he had already spoiled. "This is monstrous. I protest." "You are free to," Purbright agreed, "and I imagine you have rehearsed." He turned a page of the ledger, then another, as though the act itself cooled the room. "Now the motive. Mr. Wycherley has been a strict treasurer. He has questioned expenses for lamp standards and for certain horticultural embellishments along the High Street. He has, I am told, returned invoices for the floral displays proposed by the Amenities Committee, on the grounds that private supplies from certain members' nurseries are not the borough's concern." Mrs. Plimpton drew herself up. "I will not hear innuendo about the Amenities Committee." "No innuendo," Purbright said gently. "Only the observation that men love roses, aldermen, and roses cost money. It would have been useful to remove the treasurer who remembers the price of everything, including favours." He let the ledger close softly. "Councillor Phipps, you proposed loudly that we search Mr. Wycherley's house. You were seen at the library when a box containing a stray ledger was delivered. You liaised with the printing works, from whose offcuts our forgeries were cut. You know grafting wax as other men know putty. And last evening, when a parcel of theatrical scraps was found before a large audience, you stationed yourself where you could see both the discovery and the treasurer's face." Phipps's mouth opened and closed without finding words. "As for the hiding place," Purbright went on, "you could not have carried the borough ledger far. You needed somewhere inside the chamber, close at hand, discovered only at the convenience of the story. Lowering a shelf, pressing a latch, sliding a book into a base, and replacing it under a tea-towel labelled Council, all could be done in the noise of an adjournment. Later, a tampered catch to hint at burglars, an annual to hint at Cranch, an anonymous letter to name the treasurer, and a stream of little papers to keep the town obediently excited. You do not, councillor, conceal well. You advertise cleverly." Silence ran around the room, hiding under furniture. Cranch stared at Phipps with outrage rapidly reheated into moral superiority. Mrs. Plimpton's face, having risen to an authority it had no right to, began a cautious descent. Wycherley at the edge of a chair looked like blood was returning to his hands. Phipps found his voice at last. It was never theft. I meant only to prove Wycherley obstructive. He blocks everything. The town deserves improvements. The flower show? My roses? His breath failed him where his argument did. Indeed, Purbright said, with a sympathy that had no softness in it. And improvements are so much easier when the accounts are pliant. You hope to force a resignation, not a scandal, to invite a pliable successor, not a court. But men, counsellor, have a way of enlarging their mischief by parading it. He turned to Doughty. Mr. Doughty, would you be so kind as to relock the case? We have had enough open doors for the day. The caretaker obeyed with grateful solemnity. The ledger, snug again where it belonged, made even the bookcase look relieved. Purbright faced the room as one might face a polite congregation. Sergeant Love will take a statement from Councillor Phipps. There may be other inquiries, but there need not be more theatre. Mr. Wycherley, you will prepare your quarter's accounts now that your conscience has returned from its holiday. Alderman, you will perhaps consider that decisiveness is not always a virtue when badly informed. Councillor Cranch, you will do the town a service by letting your youth rest where it lies, in an annual, not in policy. There was no applause. There seldom is at the end of a good sermon. But people breathed differently. The room, which had been leaning forward for days, finally sat back. Outside, the lamps were just beginning to stipple the square. A light rain resumed, as if to tidy the day. Purbright, hat on, looked up at the town hall's brick and stone, the kind of building that outlasts both its follies and its reformers, and allowed himself the sort of smile a man wears when a puzzle has behaved itself. "Shall we, Sergeant?" he said, and Love, bursting with restrained satisfaction, murmured, "Yes, sir," in the tone of a boy who has witnessed a conjuring trick and finally seen the thread. The days following Councillor Phipps's collapse of bravado passed with a curious blend of relief and embarrassment. Flaxborough had been given its scandal, its theatre, and its villain all in one neat parcel, and now it found itself faintly out of breath. The town, which had devoted itself so thoroughly to suspicion, gossip, and theories, seemed momentarily uncertain how to return to routine. Yet routine, in Flaxborough, was as inevitable as rain on market day. Wycherley reappeared at his office, after a brief interval of convalescent indignation. He carried himself with the air of a man whose honour had been not only preserved but polished. Clerks who had avoided his gaze before now greeted him with elaborate cheer, as if to erase their own doubts of the previous week. He accepted their kindness with dignity, though in private he was heard to mutter that forgiveness was an overrated virtue. Councillor Cranch resumed his seat in the chamber with renewed self-importance, loudly reminding all who would listen that he had always suspected something amiss, and that the rowing annual's involvement was proof only of other people's trickery. Nobody contradicted him. Flaxborough had learnt long ago that Cranch's truth was less a matter of fact than of volume. Mrs. Plimpton, for her part, found a way to turn even her error into triumph. She gave an interview to the Mercury in which she spoke of her unwavering resolve to defend public confidence, and claimed that her pressing of the case had assisted Inspector Purbright in arriving at the truth. It was received with nods by those who valued pearls over precision, and with smirks by those who did not. As for Phipps, he withdrew from public life in the manner of a man retreating from a chessboard, where he had been checkmated in 3 moves. He spoke of illness and his roses needing his constant attention. Rose, no doubt, listened sympathetically. Meanwhile, Purbright went about his days in the same unhurried way as always. Paperwork returned to his desk. Licensing queries, a lost bicycle, the ordinary trivia of police work in a town where most crimes were less serious than the descriptions they acquired in gossip. Love, however, still carried the glow of their recent victory, though it sat uneasily with his youthful eagerness. One evening, as they shared a pot of tea in the inspector's office, Love asked, "Do you think, sir, that Phipps will be charged? I mean, there's forgery and planting evidence and all that." Purbright stirred his tea thoughtfully. "The law will decide which charges are worth its time, Sergeant. Often, it is satisfied with the fall of a reputation. In Phipps's case, his name will not recover. The roses will be his only audience." Love frowned. "It seems unfair, though, doesn't it? All that fuss nearly ruining Wycherley, and he might just get to hide at home." "Life, Sergeant," Purbright said gently, "is full of injustices, some larger than others. What matters in a place like Flaxborough is balance, not punishment. The ledger is back, witchily restored, and the town's appetite for scandal sated. Balance, not vengeance, is the coin in which we are paid. Love nodded slowly, though it was plain he found the philosophy more difficult than an arrest. He returned to his cup, comforted by warmth, if not wisdom. The ledger itself resumed its silent watch from behind the glass case, which Mr. Doughty now polished daily, as if to atone for his inadvertent role. The case clock ticked on with smug regularity, pleased at having outlasted the excitement. Meetings proceeded once more in their accustomed dullness, the minutes read out and approved without controversy, and members returned to their favourite sport of proposing things that would never be done. Yet Flaxborough, for all its return to calm, did not entirely forget. There lingered an unease in the air whenever the subject of council finances arose, a faint memory of how quickly confidence could evaporate. Even the market gossipers, though quick to move on to other scandals, occasionally lowered their voices and mentioned that business with the ledger, as though to remind themselves that beneath the polish of routine lay the possibility of upheaval. For Purbright the matter was closed. He had done what was necessary, exposed what was hidden, and left the town to digest the lesson in its own slow fashion. He did not stop at triumph. Instead, he turned again to the small observations of human nature that pleased him most. How people defended their pride with the most fragile of inventions. How suspicion could be coaxed like ivy to grow in the desired direction. And how, in the end, truth often emerged not by force but by patience. One afternoon, as he and Love walked across the market square, they passed Mrs. Digby's shop. In the window, the ledgers once arranged for dramatic effect had been replaced with gardening almanacs and cookbooks. The headlines had shifted to a minor scandal about a councillor's nephew and an unfortunate mishap with a bicycle lamp. Purbright paused to glance at the display, then smiled faintly and continued on. Love, puzzled, asked, "What is it, sir?" "Only that," Purbright replied. "The world has a merciful way of forgetting." "And forgetting, Sergeant, is sometimes the kindest form of justice." They walked on, their steps unhurried, blending into the rhythm of a town that had already begun to cover its embarrassment with fresh chatter. The missing ledger was no longer missing, the guilty had been shown, and Flaxborough, like the rain-washed cobblestones of its square, had returned to looking much as it always had. But beneath the surface, faint and enduring, lay the memory of how fragile respectability could be when nudged by ambition and polished by deceit. Back at the station, Purbright sat at his desk, dipping his pen in ink to sign the day's reports. Love, watching him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity, ventured one last question. "Sir, do you ever tire of it? These little scandals, the way people make so much of so little?" Purbright looked up, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "On the contrary, Sergeant. It is in little things that people reveal themselves most honestly. The grand crimes are usually dull, but the petty intrigues, they tell us everything about vanity, pride, and the games of reputation. One might almost say they are the true accounts of the town." He returned to his papers. Outside, the clock on St. Michael's struck the hour, steady and inevitable. Life in Flaxborough resumed its proper scale, tidy, gossiping, faintly absurd yet always instructive to the man patient enough to observe. And so the affair of the missing ledger ended, not with uproar but with a quiet resettling, like dust in a sunbeam after a door has closed. The week after the ledger's return, Flaxborough settled back into its peculiar calm, though not without the faint stiffness of a town that had been caught gossiping too loudly and was now determined to look innocent. The scandal that had rattled drawing-rooms, council chambers, and even the snug of the Crown and Mitre was already being folded into memory, trimmed into anecdotes told with sly relish and with varying degrees of invention. Yet beneath the chatter there lingered an acknowledgement that the town had been taught a lesson, though, being Flaxborough, it preferred not to admit what the lesson was. Inspector Purbright, for his part, took no pride in his success, nor did he speak of it in the self-congratulatory tone some had expected. He accepted with quiet civility the thanks of Wycherley, who declared himself forever in the inspector's debt. He endured, with good humour, Councillor Cranch's insistence that he had always smelt a rat, and would have exposed Phipps sooner or later. He listened with his usual patience to Mrs. Plimpton, who contrived to make herself appear not only prescient but indispensable to the entire affair, To each Purbright offered the same mild courtesy, as though the entire matter had been no more than a misplaced umbrella that had finally found its way home. Only Sergeant Love pressed for more. One evening, unable to contain himself, he asked, "Sir, if Phipps hadn't scattered those scraps and staged those silly tricks, would we ever have found the ledger? I mean, it seems odd that someone so determined to frame Wycherley should also have made it so easy to unravel." Purbright regarded him for a moment, the faintest glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "That, Sergeant, is the paradox of vanity. A man who craves not simply success but admiration will always leave his work where it can be seen. Had Phipps destroyed the ledger, or hidden it in some field, he might never have been found out. But then there would have been no performance, no audience to marvel at his cleverness. He wished not merely to win, but to be admired for winning. It is always vanity, not malice, that trips such men." Love nodded, half in awe, half in puzzlement. "So, in a way, we only caught him because he wanted us to." "Precisely," Purbright said softly. "The most obliging criminals are those who cannot resist rehearsing their applause." In the weeks that followed, Flaxborough resumed its usual concerns. The price of coal, the fortunes of the football club, the arrangements for the spring flower show that now seemed faintly tarnished by association. Phipps was no longer seen at committee meetings. His resignation was announced quietly, attributed to health and domestic concerns, though everyone knew it was roses that had claimed him. His garden became a local curiosity, admired at a distance but never visited, as though the blooms themselves were guilty. Wycherley regained his confidence, though he worked now with an air of martyrdom, as if every figure he balanced were another stone on his personal Calvary. Cranch returned to boasting about rowing and lamp standards, having neatly edited himself out of the scandal. Mrs. Plimpton continued to glide through the town with pearls intact, convinced her steadfastness had guided all to safety. The Mercury, having wrung every last drop of sensation from the case, shifted its headlines to a minor theft of poultry, and Purbright, he remained exactly as he had been, strolling through the square with his thoughtful eyes, attending meetings where nothing much happened, listening to gossip with polite indifference. If people looked at him with a little more respect than before, he neither encouraged nor discouraged it. He had long known that in towns like Flaxborough, justice was best delivered quietly, folded into routine so that no one felt obliged to change too much. One afternoon, as he and Love crossed the square, the sergeant said with a smile, "It's funny, sir. A whole town is in uproar over a book of sums." Purbright's gaze followed the pigeon strutting beneath the market cross. "Not funny, Sergeant. Inevitable. In Flaxborough, reputation is more delicate than truth, and the ledger was not merely a book of sums, it was a mirror. Each man feared what it might reflect. That fear was enough to make a performance of crime." He adjusted his hat and continued on, leaving behind the square the murmurs of gossip and the faint smell of rain that always seemed to linger in Flaxborough's air. The missing ledger was missing no longer, but the lesson it had revealed, that vanity, pride, and small ambitions can twist even the dullest of books into a weapon, would remain quietly in the inspector's thoughts. And with that, life in Flaxborough returned to its peculiar balance, its scandals buried under fresh chatter, its respectability restored by habit. Inspector Purbright resumed his quiet watch, knowing that sooner or later another small absurdity would grow into a scandal, and another truth would wait, patiently, to be uncovered by anyone with the patience to listen.